Tim, now let's take a closer look at something that we're seeing in the news this week. We're not financial analysts, and we don't pretend to be them. But it's hard to overlook some of the big financial stories that we see, especially when they impact the enterprise technology industry. And that's why this week we're going to be looking at Google Cloud in a little bit more depth. So, in the 3 years that Google has been releasing financial metrics for their cloud business, they've never turned a profit until now. Their offerings under this umbrella include the Google Cloud Platform, which you may be aware of, along with Google Workspace, which has had many, many names, but is basically, the Google Drive stuff. These two products now account for 10% of Alphabet's total revenue. And this is actually a wonderful thing because, as you know, most of Alphabet's revenue comes from advertising. This comes from actually, making stuff work in the enterprise, which is great. Does this mean that the cloud business is going to be increasingly a priority for Google?
I personally think it does. In fact, this article really exploited a couple things that I didn't know about Google Cloud. One, that it's been just 3 years since they have been reporting these financial metrics, but also that that business unit had not been profitable until now. I was having a conversation with the team over at the Cables to Clouds podcast, and they had mentioned that they were kind of interested to see where Google was going to take this cloud business over the next X amount of years, because it really does seem that Google as a company wants to embrace and develop AI is what seems to be a top priority for them. So I think we weren't really sure what that was going to mean for the different cloud business units that Google has. Now that they're turning a profit and showing that they're really starting to get market share, I do think that means a lot and is good for Google to continue to invest in these platforms. Google Workspace is an interesting one for me. As you said, it's been around in one form or another, many different names for different years, but we're really talking about the email and collaboration apps. And it really does seem that they are starting to make a push. Not only, since the beginning, it's been great for consumers, right? Like many people have had Gmail accounts, use Google Drive. It does seem like they're really starting to make a push into the enterprise space in giving some competition back to Microsoft. So it'll be really interesting to see how they continue to develop both of those cloud offerings and how much market share they can get, not only on the workspace side, but also getting more and more customers into the Google Cloud platform.
Another thing I'd say, Tim, is, we have to look at this a little bit with a grain of salt because, of course, Google has had quite a lot of layoffs recently. And so a cynic could look at this and say, well, yeah, they turned a profit because they got rid of all the people. And I'm sure that getting rid of all the people didn't hurt. But there was another thing in the disclosures, the SEC filings, that really piqued my interest. And this is something that I haven't seen much discussion of online yet. And that is that Google is extending the useful life of its servers and networking equipment to 6 years. This is a huge change for the hyperscalers. One of the reasons that we're in the tech recession that we're in other words, all these tech companies are facing such huge financial headwinds, everyone from component manufacturers like, RAM and SSDs and hard drives, all the way up to the chip makers, to the big OEMs, the software vendors, is that all of these companies were so dependent on revenue from the hyperscalers for quite a few years here, especially during the pandemic when it seemed like everybody was working from home and everybody needed online services and all the companies invested and hired and hired. Well, all of that came to a screeching halt last year. And in fact, somebody slammed the car into reverse, started getting rid of people, started trimming acquisitions, stopped buying. And that's been a huge issue for so many of the products and technologies that we talk about here on the rundown. This news is actually a huge, huge shot across the bow of the enterprise technology companies. And as I said, I haven't seen a lot of discussion of this online. So one of the things that you need to know about the collision between finance and technology is that equipment can either be written off the day you buy it, or it can be depreciated over a number of years. And depreciation essentially says that the useful life of a piece of equipment is so many years, and therefore I'm going to declare, I'm going to annualize the tax hit, or the tax benefit actually, of that over time. Now, it's easy to think of this in something like a big bulldozer or a printing press or something that may be good for 30 years. It's a lot harder when you're talking about IT equipment. And traditionally, IT equipment has been depreciated much, much shorter. In fact, a lot of companies don't bother to depreciate, but some of those companies that do are looking at 3 or 4 years, not 6 years. So Google is now depreciating over 6 years. What this means is that Google is not only saying that this equipment will, from a tax perspective, be useful for 6 years, but they're also making a commitment to their investors that they're going to try to get 6 years of useful life out of this equipment. And that is huge, because think about it. If Google is going to refresh their equipment, let's say every 4 years they refresh a given piece of equipment, they throw it out, get a new one in there, and then they move to 6 years, that means that they're buying, not as much equipment, maybe half as much equipment, especially now. Because what happens is, in the time that you go from a shorter depreciation to a longer depreciation, well, you might not be buying as much equipment in that window. This obviously applies only to new stuff, but there's not as much new stuff coming in. So what this means, I think, is that there's this tech recession that we're living through. It's not stopping. It's not going to stop soon. And in fact, it's going to be with us for at least a few more years as hyperscalers like Google slow their purchasing, try to get more useful life out of equipment, and try to continue to make better use and actually, make profitable use of the equipment, people, and products that they have. So all of this goes to basically say that, the cloud industry isn't maturing. The cloud industry has matured. And now we're looking at companies like Google and Amazon Web Services that are trying to make money here instead of just trying to blindly invest.
I do think the number of 6 years is quite large for a hyperscaler. I mean, in the hyperscaler DevOps world of move fast and break things, constantly churning in applications and systems, including hardware, committing to 6 years does seem like a big deal to me. Now, we're talking a lot about the finances here. Is this, Stephen, do you think this is mainly geared toward finances, or is there potentially a sustainability play from the hyperscalers, especially Google, in committing to longer term commitments on their gear?
Yeah, the sustainability thing is interesting. And I'm glad you brought that up, Tim, because it's kind of a double-edged sword. Think about the power and cooling requirements and processing capabilities of the devices that you bought 6 years ago. And now think about the products that you have today. I mean, 6 years ago, this would have been a magical, unheard of phone. And yet today, this is what everybody has. The there's kind of a push and pull here when it comes to sustainability, because on the one hand, nothing is more financially sustainable and environmentally sustainable than continuing to use something well past its intended lifespan. A 1992 Chevy Suburban is lower impact on the environment than a brand new Tesla. That is for sure, even taking into account the gas mileage and energy efficiency of the thing, simply because you didn't have to make a new one. And yet, and yet, there isn't, it is true that eventually you have to refresh this stuff, and the new stuff is much more efficient, both in terms of energy and performance. And so I'm a little bit interested here because, on the one hand, you could say, yeah, from a sustainability perspective, Google is going to benefit because they're going to use stuff longer, and not buying stuff, not producing stuff, and using what you've got longer is better for the environment. It's better for shareholders. It's better for everybody. That is true. But continuing to rely on 15 nanometer servers when we've got 3 nanometer parts coming is not better for the environment, because it's going to take so much more power and cooling. And some of this stuff has become literally an order of magnitude better in terms of the power versus performance curve over a 6 year time frame. So it is quite possible that this could actually be a net negative, even though we're not manufacturing new stuff and we're getting more life out of stuff. But that's not true for everything, and it's probably better for them to continue using stuff as long as it's still useful and productive, instead of continually buying new stuff.